Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good morning. Jim Hannick here, taking the place of Bob Olson, who is still on the mend from some serious health problems. And I welcome you to the open door. We hope to be open to God's love, open to the Spirit, and open to our listeners. And we remind listeners that we have archived all of these shows over the years and that they are available. Just go to WCAT and move then to the open door. But then there are many other series as well. It's a real cornucopia. This morning, we're going to once again, from a Catholic perspective, look at the Solidarity Party, the American Solidarity Party platform, and we've come to the very last plank in that platform, and it certainly is not the least of the planks. In fact, if you were to go to the party platform on the website, you would find it to be the first plank of the platform. And once again, I'm going to read with minimal annotation, I hope, the introductory paragraph of that plank, and then we will go point by point through the particulars. So, we begin. We believe, the plank reads, that respect for the dignity of human life, and we've spoken before, all right, first annotation, of the source and nature of the dignity of human life. We believe that respect for the dignity of human life is the most basic tenet of a civilized society. This dignity is unconditional. And when that claim is made, a huge claim is made. The dignity is unconditional. It is never reduced by factors such as usefulness or wantedness. From the moment of conception until natural death, annotation, many of our Catholic listeners have heard that phrase, from the moment of conception until natural death, every human being is entitled to protections under the law, to just treatment, and to equitable consideration. One more time for listeners who don't have this text available. We believe that respect for the dignity of human life is the most basic tenet of a civilized society. This dignity is unconditional. It is never reduced by factors such as usefulness or wantedness. From the moment of conception until natural death, every human being is entitled to protections under the law, to just treatment, and to equitable consideration. Rhonda, you, a Catholic professor of philosophy and prolific author, have written about the right to life in many, many contexts, and you've also been on the street, prayer warrior, counselor at abortion facilities. Would you like us to think about anything particular here as we look at this first paragraph?
Yes. Well, I have difficulty with this. Okay, usefulness and wantedness absolutely of cost, but everything that follows under the list of opposed doesn't fall under those categories exactly. So I'm just wondering about the wording of it.
Within this first paragraph?
For instance, the fact that someone kills 25 people out of rage of some sort is very different than wanting him dead because he's not useful or wanted as an intrinsic human person. You know, so having this capital punishment thrown in there, see, the way as I recall, the way it's put in the catechism is that a capital punishment should be ruled out whenever there's another way to ensure that this person isn't a danger to the community. Now, presumably in the United States of America, we have such wonderful prisons, of course, run, never prisons where people actually engage in escaping from the prison. Never prisons where any of the prison guards are selling drugs to the prisoners, etc., etc. That we feel very confident that we can keep them for life if they're psychotic killers. But that's not true all over the world, etc. So to throw it in as if it's the same issue because of the word unconditional seems to me very problematic.
So you're calling attention to the last of the bullet points. Capital punishment. Capital punishment. Yes. Because
you're saying this dignity is unconditional. Well,
yes.
It's not that he's not a person and we don't minister to him as much as we can and love him and care for him and forgive him and be merciful to him. But it's not as if we teach that no matter what someone does, they never forfeit their right to life. See?
Yes.
In principle.
Yes. And in looking at that first paragraph, you rightly note that if we say this about every human life, then we have to look to its implications for capital punishment. And in fact, if you look down to the bottom here of this particular plank, capital punishment is specifically mentioned. And you mentioned that in our country it seems like we could confidently keep the worst sort of killer in isolation, and you mentioned that that's not the case in other countries.
Well,
so
besides that, if you say the dignity of human life, you have to make it sounds as if it's a pacifist statement, because if a policeman kills this man who's killing in the midst of killing 25 people in the church, he's not acting as if so now that comes under just treatment or equitable consideration. We don't consider that the policeman has no sense of the dignity of human life because he's taking this life. So the idea of capital punishment is that since the person is not a danger to the community, we should err on the side of mercy, or we should express mercy rather than justice. So I just think the wording, once you see capital punishment in the list, the wording is a little ambiguous.
All right. We could certainly look to that. Let me invite John, though, to make a comment as we get started.
I think Dr. Shervin has made a very good point, that the wording is rather ambiguous, but they seem to be pretty clear when it comes to capital punishment. So I kind of sense an inconsistency almost, rather. I'm not convinced that capital punishment is an intrinsic evil. Even the Catholic Church hasn't outright condemned capital punishment. They put down some principles where it could be just, but they also have said where in certain countries, depending on their abilities to contain prisoners, capital punishment may not be the best option, and they could try other avenues to achieve a just end. So for other countries with limited resources, say third world countries, they may be forced to do that. So thus a
concern you have as well.
I'm sorry?
It's a concern, Professor Shervin's concern is one that you share.
Yeah, I do.
All right. Well, here are a few thoughts. Kind of a general thought is whenever we've started on the introductory paragraph to one of the planks, we've ricocheted from that introductory paragraph to particulars, and that's fine. It's just kind of a pattern we've had. Here's a first comment I would have, and it's what I call a sidebar. Oftentimes, if you're using textbooks, you have the basic expository sections of the textbook, but then you have sidebars off to the side. If people are interested in little things, you could direct them there. And I'm sure that there are sidebars in newspapers too, except I don't think they're on the side of the page. They're usually highlighted in the middle of the page. There was a article within the last three days about the worst of the drug cartel leaders from Mexico who escaped repeatedly from prisons in Mexico. And some people might recall his last escape. A tunnel was built from well outside the prison, under the prison, and into the shower stall of the well-guarded prisoner. Well, he was well-guarded, I suppose, from outside his cell, but he managed to escape by going through this tunnel. Fast forward, he's now in Manhattan, as in Manhattan, New York City, way up high in a federal building. And now the complaint from his court-appointed lawyer, who is working in conjunction with a private lawyer. And why a court-appointed lawyer? Because access to all funds were frozen. And so while this individual is doubtless and truly filthy rich, he can't pay for a lawyer. But now there is an effort to connect him with his own lawyer, and the lawyer's complaint is that he has so little access to the prisoner. It's always, and very rarely the case that he meets him at all, it's always him speaking to the prisoner through a very, very, very solid, bulletproof glass window. And the only way that they can hear each other is their tiny, tiny pinpricks in the window. And I'm sure that if we were, say, in third world countries, downtown Mogadishu, and what's left of Somalia, if there's much left at all, if we were in downtown Mogadishu, there wouldn't be that kind of possibility of security for such murderous people, and they truly are. Now, stop me at any point, but the next thing I'd like to say is that if life is a basic good, and it's incommensurable and non-fungible, it seems to me that we can recognize its true value if and only if we never intentionally seek to destroy it. And that would be the case if we could look to the principle of double effect, not casuistically understood, but understood in a common sense sort of way. And actually, good casuistry just tries to catalog good common sense. At any rate, if what someone is doing is stopping an act of aggression and using the minimal force necessary to stop that act of aggression, one might very well know that the minimal force necessary to stop that act of aggression will in all probability be lethal. But if in fact the act of aggression is stopped and the minimal force necessary to prevent that act of aggression turns out not to be lethal, then the one who stops the act of aggression doesn't march forward to the still breathing criminal and shoot him in the head. That would be judged as a wrongful homicide, and it would be judged as a wrongful homicide even in the not-so-great city of Los Angeles by any kind of a civilian police review board, which review boards are not steeped in Catholic moral theology. They simply require that the minimal force necessary to stop act of aggression be used. In certain circumstances, one can't use mace because one doesn't have it. In certain circumstances, one can't use an invisible trap door to have the perpetrator fall through into a pit. In some cases, one has to use a service revolver or more. But nonetheless, the idea is to stop the act of aggression. A way of thinking about this, just to highlight the dignity of the perpetrator, costs money to run a jail, lots and lots of money. More money is spent in California on running jails and prisons than is spent on the schools. So suppose an enterprising warden has this scheme come to mind. Here we have these people on death row. They're truly repulsive people. Many people have a visceral hatred of them. Why don't we charge $100 per visitor and allow these visitors to come in and put out cigarettes on the arms of these felons? And then for $150, you could put out cigarettes on the faces of these felons. It wouldn't even involve killing them. It would just be an opportunity to express your deep hatred for what they've done. Well, that would be an enterprising warden. But I think we would say, no, the whole point of that activity would be to at least initiate torture. And torture is incompatible with the dignity of human life. Now, I think that the only way really to justify capital punishment is to point out that in some cases capital punishment is closely analogous with legitimate self-defense. But legitimate self-defense seeks to defend oneself or an innocent third party. Its intent is not to kill the person, however repulsive the person is and however the person might be acting. So I think those concerns that have been raised can be dealt with. But I just gave a little speech, which is one of my weaknesses. So feel free to dismantle or deconstruct.
Sure. You mentioned,
go ahead, John.
Well, Rhonda, when you come back a little louder. I guess John last week.
Brian, is this better?
Yes, that's perfect. Last week, Norm, if you remember, he has such
my problem is if I pick up the phone, if I lay it down, then it doesn't cut out. If I pick it up, it cuts out unexpectedly. But
if you can.
Okay, I will try.
Yeah. Last week, Norm.
It seems to me I would want to make a distinction between repentant criminals and criminals who are actively trying to get out of the jail by killing the gods in terms of capital punishment. Something like that. But I mean, it's. I realize it's very hard to discuss, but the problem is in terms of getting people to love the American Solidarity Party and support it. For many people, this is a huge issue for which they will never vote for a party that outlaws capital punishment for the reasons that we were talking about.
I think for those people, the teaching of the Catholic Church on that is going to be also a terrible hurdle.
No, because it makes a distinction between where there's no other possibilities.
Oh, no. So to speak.
No, I mean, it makes a distinction between where there's no need to protect the people from the danger. See, but as long as they don't trust the jail system, and as long as they hear about prisoners getting out easily, I mean, not easily, but they hear about prisoners getting out, they naturally want to protect themselves against homicidal maniacs. And that's legitimate.
Yes, it is, but there are homicidal maniacs among the schizophrenic population as well. You can't say, because something might happen, we are going to kill them. That can't be said. That's not compatible with Catholic teaching.
Well, but I mean, that's what you're doing if you say we can't ensure that this person won't, we can't ensure that, let's say back to your, place, your primitive place. We can't put them in a condition where they won't be dangerous to others. And so since they forfeited their life by killing innocent people, we don't have to keep them alive.
No, there's no objection anywhere in the party to self-defense. And there are cases...
But I think many people who dislike this plank think it is a form of, they're doing it because of the right to self-defense. They say, I think people who are out there serially killing 25 people because they're insane don't have a right to life on this earth. God can do with them what they want. He wants.
Yes, but I think, once again, Catholic teaching would say, if it's possible, take away the if it's possible. One may use whatever legitimate force is necessary to stop an aggressor.
Yeah, but if a man has a predilection because he's psychotic to kill people whenever he has a chance, then, you can't make that just given the way people are nowadays. I mean, you read Fox News, every other article in Fox News is an article about some outrageous killing of innocent people.
Well, let's shift the venue just a little bit, and John, you get back in right away after I shift the venue. There are any number of people who have a history of sexual predation, far more than have a history of wanton killing. Someone might argue that all of these people ought to be castrated. In fact, many people do argue that. But that position would be wholly contrary to Catholic moral theology. If you want to shoot someone very strategically as the predator is advancing towards you, amen, do it. But you can't say, given the recidivism among sexual predators, and given the likelihood that the majority of them won't be kept in jail until they die, when they are apprehended, they ought to be, as a preventative measure, castrated. That would be an act of mutilation, and it's completely opposed to Catholic moral teaching. Now, would a majority of people perhaps vote for that? I wouldn't be surprised. A majority of people support nuclear deterrence. A majority of people support all kinds of things that are in opposition to Catholic moral teaching. But the capital punishment consideration is not distinctive in that regard.
Okay,
Well, the whole thing. Sorry.
Let's have John take a crack from the vision of a student as opposed to a teacher.
Well, the whole thing with castration, that falls into the whole doctrine of the church's teaching on sterilization. So any form of sterilization, basically, the church opposes. So naturally, that wouldn't be a legitimate option to go. But originally I was
not
thinking
like the church's opposition to sterilization is somehow stronger than the church's opposition to the taking of human life.
That's true. And I think the whole reason why they're not absolutely specific, one way, black and white on it, is that they're holding out hope, hope against hope, that the person in question will convert and possibly, live a new life. But there's also a matter of justice. Not only to the person who committed the crime, but to the person who the crime was committed against. So, when I originally wanted to comment on when you talked there was about the whole cigarette thing with the prisoners there. Putting out the bodies there. And that kind of reminded me of a book I read from Rear Admiral Jeremiah Denton, who was a prisoner of war in North Vietnam for 7 years. One of the things that the prison guards would do to incite propaganda is they would march the prisoners side by side, handcuffed, through the streets of Hanoi for the people to see and to abuse them, basically. So that was just one image that...
Yes. It's interesting. He has some of his writings are in a number of contemporary ethics anthologies. He's quite widely read.
Yeah, he's one of my personal heroes there.
Yes. Well, Senator McCain was tortured. And it's interesting that he's one of the first to oppose proposals that this government engage in acts of torture.
Well, probably because he was on the receiving end of it at one point.
Yeah.
So, and then I also kind of thought back to what you said about the taking of another person's life in self-defense, and you made a really good point there where, in the example of a police officer, they shoot to stop. The use of deadly force is meant to stop the perpetrator, not so much to kill him. With that said, they're not trying to nick the person, only shoot him in the shoulder or whatnot. They're trying to hit in the center of mass of the body to stop the person. And if the person dies as a account of that, then that's kind of as an accident to the act of stopping the person.
Accident in the Thomistic sense of praeter intentionem, outside of the intention, and the intention, very interestingly, in Thomistic thought, is seen as parallel to form. We have this fundamental matter-form distinction. When we look at a behavior, let's call it a physical behavior, we haven't yet identified the act that we're interested in. We could say descriptively, this happened, this happened, this happened. It would be the physical behavior. Ah, yes, but what did the person do? Well, then we go from the physical behavior to the act. And what is it that makes the act to be that act and not some other act? Well, it's the agent's intention, which serves as a form. And if the intention is the stopping of the aggressor, then what we want to say is the police officer acted to defend the innocent person or acted to defend himself. And it's interesting, intentions not only give form to physical behaviors so as to constitute an act, but intentions shape the character of the agent. Imagine, for example, that you find out that your next door neighbor is a police officer, and the police officer has had a long career, and one day you get talking to your next door neighbor, the police officer, and you say, gee, did you ever kill anyone in the line of duty? And the police officer says, yes, regretfully, most police officers never have to use a gun in action, but I did. I was on the homicide squad, and I actually killed 4 people. Well, you never then come home and say, gosh, I just discovered that the next door neighbor is a killer. Because to describe someone as a killer is to say that he has the heart, the character, the mind of someone who seeks to kill other people. But your next door neighbor, the police officer, didn't. His intention was to stop acts of aggression. And I don't think that's chopping logical hairs. I think that's a common sense distinction.
Yeah, that is true. And even if a police officer kills a person, in self-defense, even if it's justified, it's still labeled as a homicide, because it's the taking of a life of another person. Now, that sounds like harsh language, but that's the proper label of it.
The term homicide is a legal term there, and he did kill a human being. But he doesn't have the mind and heart of a killer. He has the mind and heart of somebody who acts to save other people. Now, there's a distinction here, and this distinction about intention is, well, Catholic thinkers have again and again called attention to this. I have 2 points in mind. Point number 1, the father of sociology is Emil Durkheim. He's said to be the father of sociology. He might have been one of the fathers, but if you have a sociology book, lots of times it will say, and the father of this discipline is. Well, his first major work was entitled Suicide. And in this first major work, Suicide, and it's got a subtitle, he wanted to approach it all as a good behavioral scientist. So he said, we're not going to talk about intention. We're going to talk about whether or not someone does something that he knows will bring about his death. Someone does something that he knows or has every reason to think will bring about his death. Anyone who falls under that description commits suicide. Well, there go all the martyrs of the Catholic Church. It turns out that the vast majority of them committed suicide. Just a couple of days ago in Afghanistan, a bodyguard, security agent, whose hobby was weightlifting, saw someone who he really thought was a suicide killer, and he really did turn out to be a suicide killer. And what did he do? This fellow ran over and embraced him in a bear hug. And a bear hug from this weightlifter was no small thing. A suicide vest went off. A number of people died, but not nearly so many died as would have died otherwise, so say the bystanders. And for Durkheim, this would be another case of suicide. But we would say, no, that's not a case of suicide at all. That's a misunderstanding of the nature of the action. How does the misunderstanding of the nature of the action come about? Because of a refusal to acknowledge the role of intention. Why would you refuse to acknowledge the role of intention? Because you're approaching the social sciences from a positivist point of view. You can't deal with mental acts. You can only deal with observable behaviors. And the law is, despite its roots in English common law, roots way, way, way down, the law is largely expressed in positive terms today. So somebody could be engaged in homicide, but we wouldn't call that person, I don't think you or I or Professor Shervin or or a common sense person, somebody who's not in the clutches of positivism, I think would simply say, no, this person, yes, he killed somebody, but he's not a killer. Well, that was another speech. Rhonda.
It's a very good speech.
Well, so what I want to say in defense of the platform is the platform, when you come to the plank on personal security, is very clear. There's no objection to self-defense. But unless capital punishment is understood in terms of self-defense, and I think for the most part by people who support it, it's not really understood that way at all. It's more understood in Kantian terms. Somehow or other, retribution is the core consideration. Now, retribution is not the same as revenge. Somebody could have no spirit of revenge whatsoever, be terribly troubled by the need because of retribution to execute a prisoner, but nonetheless go ahead and execute the prisoner, although the prisoner is no threat at any point to society, but it's a matter of retribution. But the Kantian view of justifying capital punishment on the basis of retribution just isn't the Church's view. And Francis has made that clear, and even after the Catechism was first written, John Paul II went on to make that clear, so that there had to be a clarification within the Catechism.
I had a question.
Yes.
If I may pose it.
Yes, please. It's the only way to avoid speech. John, it's the only way to avoid speeches.
Anyway, thank you. Under this plank, the right to life, would this cover the person's right to bear arms, under the whole principle of self-defense?
Yes. Yes. The platform, this is interesting. The platform has nothing to say about gun ownership.
Yeah, I noticed that, and I was kind of wondering why.
Well, there are various levels of explanation. The first level of explanation is, in order for anything to be in this platform, it had to pass a 2/3 vote of the membership.
Okay.
So you had to have what's called an absolute majority of the membership in order to be in the platform. And in the platform revision process, as I recall it, now this is going to be pretty accurate, but not 100% accurate. We had 3 columns. Column 1, original platform. Column 2, proposed change. Column 3, what would you like to vote with regard to this proposed change? Yes, no, or the third option would be better that we say nothing than that we say either of what's in the original platform or this revised platform version. So there were 2 or 3 things that got the better to say nothing. And one was the legalization of marijuana. And one was something about recognition of the civil rights of people involved in same-sex marriages. And I don't think the gun control thing even made it to the level of the first or second platform. But unless you have a 2/3 support of the membership, silence. Now, does that lead to fights? Facebook fights? Does it ever? Why do we have to have 2/3? Why can't we have 51%?
I had a thought about this morning. When people talk about gun control, they're always talking about, horrible situations where people, killers, have guns. But there's no statistic, I'm not saying there could be, but there's no statistic about how many people weren't killed because they were protected by someone having a gun.
That's right.
Yes,
But
anti-Esalen is...
even in the sense that X person who wants to kill so-and-so happens to know that so-and-so has a gun in the house and therefore doesn't go there. I mean, you can't make statistics on such a thing. But I mean, the basic thing that killers, they kill because they have hate in their hearts, not because they have guns, because Cain didn't have a gun and he managed to kill Abel just the same, right?
Right.
You know, sort of thing.
He might have gotten to him earlier if he'd had a gun, though.
You can argue that guns are more effective than others, and therefore in the hands of killers they're worse. And I mean, this argues for much more, surveillance of people buying guns, et cetera, et cetera. But every day here in Texas, where I moved from Connecticut just less than a year ago, I mean, not every day, but every week I meet some woman who's telling me she's buying a gun because she doesn't feel safe.
Right.
Gosh,
So it's not such a simple analysis, this thing.
There are lots of stories, as you know. First point on what we need is a statistic about the number of lives that were saved. Anthony Esalen, another well-known Catholic writer, has just very recently argued that he thinks that we need a statistic like that. That's one sidebar, or maybe I should say piggyback because you mentioned it first. Another consideration, very, very interesting, is that the Diocese of Dallas, that's in Texas. When I lived in San Antonio, people, when the weather was going to get cool, would say, there's a norther blowing in. Where from? Dallas. That's how big Texas is. At any rate, the Diocese of Dallas had posted signs in churches saying no guns allowed. That's very interesting. However, the signs have recently been taken down. Why? Well, the diocese said, given this hideous phenomenon of people bursting into churches, killing people, probably be better if we didn't say anything about it one way or another. Now, there are those who would say the diocese had been in consultation with Jesuitical minds. Perhaps Pope Francis would say, all of that smacks of casuistry. But it's an interesting point. Here's a third, or maybe I'm up to 4 already. Within the last week, and this was posted on the Solidarity Party Facebook, in Atlanta, and you could Google this, it's not that old news, it's within the last week, there was a home invasion. And it was taped, it was video because of the security cameras. Now, I'm a little curious about the home invasion. That's also a legal term because it looked like it was the invasion of a mini warehouse, which might have been attached to a restaurant, which might have had a home above the restaurant. But it was treated as a home invasion. And the whole thing is on video. You can see it. Go to Atlanta, home invasion, owner defense or something like that. You can get the news account. 3 guys broke into the back of a store. And it was just like a TV show, waving these guns around, and they didn't think anybody was there. And nobody was there for maybe 20 seconds. And then out pops a diminutive Asian lady, fires away at all 3 of them. One of them was hit. And they showed the expression on the faces of these people as they saw what was happening. and then about another 20 seconds later, her husband comes. And they're both, swinging around with their pistols, on all these television shows. Somebody will say, "Clear, clear," as they go from room to room.
Wow.
But that was the case, an extraordinarily dramatic case of the use of weapons to defend one's property, and very well have been to defend one's life. Philosopher John Locke is oftentimes ridiculed for putting property rights so very high on the list, but if you go back to look at his essay on human understanding, he says, because after all, if somebody can take all of your property, what's the difference between that and starving to death? So that was before the safety net. But at any rate, now here's the next and last point, Scout's honor, even though I never was one. Scout's honor. There are statistics that show that the majority of deaths resulting from people owning handguns, having the handguns in their own homes, significant majority of the deaths that result from that are suicide. So somebody wants to buy a gun. Well, okay, you can buy a gun. Why do you want to buy a gun? Because I want to defend myself. Well, statistically, most people who have a gun and the gun is used to kill somebody kill themselves.
That's very sad.
That is just Elizabeth Anscombe, my favorite philosopher of contemporary philosophers, often used this expression, the endless twistiness of the human mind. I think that's evidence for it. Now, my dad had a gun. I was very surprised. He had a gun. He never used it. But I'm thinking to myself, he had a terrible temper. And all things considered, I wished he hadn't had a gun. And his best friend had a gun, had emphysema, and killed himself with his own gun. All of which gives us pause. Are you there, folks?
Yes.
Absolutely.
You're pausing.
Yeah. Well,
Lord have mercy on all those people.
Yes.
Pray, Lord have mercy on all those people with guns. May they not commit suicide.
Yes.
May there be no need someday for anyone to protect themselves against killers.
Yes.
And Jesus, we're kind of overwhelmed.
Very often.
We're overwhelmed by the amount of evil in our world today.
Yeah.
And help us to be a help.
Yes. Yes. Well, let me now, we're down to our usual 10 minutes, and what have we done? Looked at the introductory paragraph, which is only 4 lines, and one of the bullet points. Let me call attention to the 4th bullet point, which connects directly with what we've been talking about, or I've been yakking about. The 4th bullet point. Policies that prevent the tragedy of suicide, including universal access to affordable mental health care. We don't have universal access to affordable mental health care. In the county of Los Angeles, which has in the neighborhood of 13 million people, there are two mental health hospitals that the court can require people to be cared for by. And they both have long waiting lists. And that's California. So policies that help prevent the tragedy of suicide, including universal access to affordable mental health care. And then, up at the top of the list, it should be there, Constitutional amendment that affirms that personhood begins at conception and declares that there is no right to abortion under the U.S. Constitution, thus reversing Roe versus Wade and its progeny. Now, this is very interesting in a kind of a technical way. None of the major right-to-life groups want to work on constitutional amendments or legislation that speak of personhood beginning at conception. Try that with national right to life, you won't get anywhere. It's seen as quixotic. It's seen as something that has no hope whatsoever of convincing anyone. And in a couple of places where it's been on the ballot, it has in fact lost. But the party says what we're interested in is a constitutional amendment that affirms that personhood begins at conception. And I think that's worth noting. And then I want to skip to 5 from the bottom. If you're looking at this on a sheet of paper, it's on the second page, but the platform begins with "we support," and then it comes to "and we oppose." What's the first thing? We oppose compounding the tragedy of abortion through criminal penalties against the women who obtained them. Now, splits in the pro-life movement. My wife Elizabeth, who has been involved in pro-life efforts since well before I was, 1972 in Michigan, 1972, is on a board of a pro-life group called California Nurses for Ethical Standards. And I always, being the professor type, think, yeah, nobody's going to say they're against ethical standards. It's the which ethical standards. At any rate, there's a movement afoot among some people in the pro-life movement to insist that there be criminal penalties for women who have abortions. And the party says, we don't think that's right at all. We think that while there are cases of repeat abortions where perhaps there's a real mens rea, a real guilt within the person, the context of abortion is such that the focus ought to be on the people who provide the abortion rather than the people who oftentimes act with diminished culpability because of any number of pressures. That's an interesting point, too. Now, the point right underneath that, intentional destruction of human embryos in any context. That's widespread, and it's supposedly in the name of good health, dealing with very difficult diseases and oftentimes genetic diseases. And I don't think that the Republican Party would support that. I think they would allow for that. Now, one last thing, because we're practically at the end. Very, very recently, like within the last 3 weeks, certainly within the last month, a lot of attention was given to Iceland because some public health agency announced that for all practical purposes, no Down syndrome children were being born in Iceland. Well, it turns out that was false because while almost no Down syndrome children were being born in Iceland, among the 85% of women who had received free screening for the possibility of Down syndrome, 15% of the people, women who were pregnant in Iceland, chose not to have that screening. And of the 15%, well, Iceland's a small country, still there were Down syndrome children born. But there has been any number of efforts to increase screening, and just very, very recently at a hearing within the United Nations, UN Human Rights Committee, one of the proponents of this said, and this is a direct quote, Though it is necessary to help disabled people once they are born, this doesn't mean that we have to accept to allow a fetus suffering with impairment to live. We must do everything we can to avoid disabilities. And there's a well-known philosopher and controversialist named Richard Dawkins who in a recent tweet, and he's just following Peter Singer, said that it might very well be immoral to have a Down syndrome child that you could prevent having by aborting the child in the womb, because after all, you would be dragging down overall utility. And a much better course would be to wait and have another a child that wouldn't have Down syndrome. Now, philosophers have been aware of this position and its public utterance by other philosophers for a good 20 years. But sooner or later, all of these things percolate up, as opposed to down, percolate up to what I might call public discourse on major media outlets, and horribly at risk now. It was already horrible, but now I think there's more of a horror, an organized effort to eliminate Down syndrome children. And Jesus wept at the thought of it. Well, what is it that Jesus said to the women outside the tomb? Go tell the brothers and sisters that I am alive, that the Lord has risen, and that there's no need to stand here weeping. Now, as it happens tomorrow, we're going to be discussing from a disability and assisted suicide conference, pro-life, of course, the question of euthanasia and assisted suicide, but that's for tomorrow. Professor Shervin won't be able to join us, but John has said he'll be there, and we'll have some other people from the Solidarity Party there as well. Rhonda, we're at 8:57. John, Rhonda, if you have some final comments, and we certainly need a final prayer, Rhonda.
Well, they're the tears that if we're not shedding them, we feel in our heart. May they help us to help the afflicted all over in one way or another. And may this party be part of that work. And may God speed everyone who is plans to run for office on this ticket. Amen.
Amen. John?
Amen.
Amen. Well, positive note, our sometimes guest, Desmond Silvera, has officially filed his papers for governor, state of California. We believe in miracles. I don't think he'll win, but I think he'll get some attention called to the sorts of issues that we've been discussing. Well, then, we thank our listeners. We remember in prayer Bob Olson, and we look forward to being here again next Friday, and as an unusual sort of thing, we'll actually be here tomorrow. It'll be at 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. So it'll be a measure of wakefulness, hitherto unknown, on West Coast participants. God bless, Godspeed. Amen.
Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.